For inviting me. I'm very excited to be with you here. There are a number of reasons why I'm excited. The holidays are coming. It's a great time. Having served in Norway and Finland, not Sweden, before coming to Canada, I'm also excited because any day in December when winter hasn't come is a golden day of my lifetime. We have a wonderful November, and so far December is doing great. And of course, the Leafs are still hanging on. They won in overtime last night, so things are still exciting in Toronto. Finally, I'm really excited about the topic of my talk here. The reason I came to talk to you, and that is really exciting agenda between the U.S. and Canada and some real progress in a world where, when you read the newspaper, there's an incredible number of bad things happening and concern, etc. There's a bright spot in U.S.-Canada relations, which has been going on for a while, and something that I think we need to build on. And so I'm glad to have the audience here today to share. I want to talk about three things briefly. One is the bilateral relationship generally, which I just referred to. The second is a little bit of a focus on Ontario, because as Consul General, my responsibility is Ontario, except for the small parts of Ontario near Ottawa and Kingston. It's a big part of Canada, it's a very important part of Canada, and that's what my role is. We have an embassy in Ottawa, and we have 7 consulates across Canada. Toronto being, of course, the center of the universe, is the biggest consulate, one of the biggest consulates in the world. And so my focus is on Ontario, as well as helping the ambassador with his broader agenda. And the third thing I'll talk about is the Beyond the Border and Regulatory Coordination Council action plans, which were released by the President and the Prime Minister last week. And then I'll take your questions on anything. If I can't answer it, I'll fake it, or I'll tell you that I can. When I talk about these 3 topics, there are 3 themes that I'd like you to keep in mind that run through all of this, as run through my approach to what we're working on. One is optimism, and I think optimism is very called for when you talk about the U.S.-Canadian relations. Realism, because there are some things out there that we can't really change, and we have to remember, and those are challenges that we have to face. And the final one is activism, which I think is good. I'm preaching to the choir a little bit by coming here to talk to you about it, because you're self-selected as people who are very interested in trade, and I think if you're a Canadian interested in trade, the U.S. is going to come in there somewhere, even if you try and keep us out. So I think your activism is going to be welcome, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So first, U.S. bilateral relations. I got here in 2009. The U.S. was still in the midst of an incredible recession, one of the worst things that many of us have faced in our lifetime. And Canada was doing better. Canada was not doing perfectly. You're very tied to us, but a very interesting thing. And U.S.-Canadian relations then and since that time have been very good. Historically, they've been good, except for a small thing 200 years ago when you weren't yet a country, and we're going to be commemorating that the War of 1812 bicentennial in coming months and in coming years. But with that one exception, we've had a great relationship for a long time. But great relationships can sometimes have incidents and have issues. But I think we're in a very golden moment, and I think that there are a number of reasons for that. I think in dark times, friends are more important than ever. Your friends are important when things are going great, and they're important in the holidays. But your friends are really important when you're having trouble, when you have something in your neighborhood that's not going right, when you have financial issues, when you have family issues. That's when you know who your real friends are. And people who have forgotten about certain friends, when they get down, they tend to remember them a little bit more. And so as we face this incredible issue in 2008, when people have used analogies like we were ready to go off the cliff, etc., the financial problems, it was natural that we would look to our friends in Canada and other places to try and help get out of it and help deal with this situation. And in addition to the fact that you're our friend, you also happen to be in better shape. So if you're having trouble paying your mortgage and your neighbor just got a promotion, maybe you're even closer to them. Your banking system is much more stable and conservative. You had a banking crisis in the 90s, and you had your own credit rating downgraded. But since then, you've made very good adjustments, and your more conservative banking approach stood you well in the crisis in 2008. You had less exposure. Therefore, you were able to help. You were able to help in international fora, having good policy ideas and being looked to as a leader. And the most recent example of that is Mark Carney being named the head of the Financial Stability Board, looking at banking and financial issues all around the world. Those who argue that Canada is not playing big in the international sphere, I don't think are paying attention. I think Carney's naming is the latest example of that, but the fact that a Canadian general was one of the leaders in charge of the Libya operation, you're a very big sacrifice and success in Afghanistan. So I think Canada is doing plenty of very important things internationally. And for the U.S., it's very good to have a partner who agrees with us on many things, shares a lot of our values, and when we disagree, we mostly disagree agreeably. Also has leadership capacity, especially in the financial area. So that meant that relations could get even better. We needed you. We always need each other, but I think at a time when we were down, friendship was even more important. In addition, I think the relationship is in a golden moment because Canada is in a particularly confident place right now. I know you're all very polite, and so you would never have particularly American characteristics and be arrogant about your success, except after the Olympics. But with that one exception, Canadians are not known for showing their exaggerated, justified confidence. But that confidence is there, and it's very important in the relationship. It's very important because unless there's some dramatic demographic change, you're always going to be 1/10 of our size. You're always going to be concentrated living near the border where we're not. So the relationship is always going to have that power differential, size differential. And that's, I won't say it's an irritant, but it's something that's always there. In my career, I've lived in Finland, which has a giant neighbor, Russia. I'm not comparing us to Russia, by the way, but they are giant. I lived in Paraguay, which has a giant neighbor, Brazil. I'm also not comparing us to Brazil. And that affects everything that happens in Paraguay and everything that happens in Finland, the fact that they've got this giant neighbor there. And I think that same is true of Canada. And it's not a criticism, it's just a matter of fact. But when Canada is confident, that the potential irritants out of that power differential are much less. When the president gives a speech and says, we have much to learn from Canada, when the president notes your banking success, etc., I think Canadians are less worried about the fact that our mere weight is going to overwhelm things, because actually you're doing a lot of things right and we've got to learn some things from you. So that also means that the relationship can be better than it is in some other times. And finally, I think the dramatically important thing is there's more trust between the two countries than there has been in recent years, and I think the Canadian ministers have said that there's one word answer to that, and that's Obama. President Obama is very well regarded in Canada. A lot of people in his campaign probably wish Canadians could vote. and I think that regard for President Obama and that trust, having come back up after having been in a not very good period for a while, that's not a partisan comment on my side, I'm not partisan, I just think it's a matter of fact, makes it possible for us to do big things and to do things that maybe weren't possible at some previous point. And that's one of the reasons that we've gotten to some big things, which I'll talk about. Secondly, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the focus we have in Ontario, because Ontario is, of course, one of the engines of Canada, and I think reading Canadian commentators, there obviously have been shifts in Canadian history, and obviously with the natural resources in the West, population changes, there have been some changes, but Ontario is still an overwhelmingly large part of Canada's population and Canada's production, and Canada's future, frankly. And I have the luck of living in Toronto, the real city in Canada, a wonderful place. Mississauga is a real city too. I just mean I don't have to live in the capital village of Ottawa, which is also a wonderful place, I'm told. It's not Toronto, it doesn't have a lease. And so we have a number of things that we're doing here, working with our partners in Ontario and other partners such as all of you, so I just thought I'd mention. Success here, the fact that we're growing the commercial relationship after a very difficult period, has been demonstrated in a couple of ways, and we're doing some things to try and build on that. We have just gotten a new commercial officer. We've long had a commerce office here in Toronto with one American foreign commercial service officer and a staff of local hires. We just got the second one who arrived this week, which is demonstration that the U.S. government finds this a very important place at a time when we're cutting resources in many places. We're adding one officer here in Toronto to deal with Ontario, and also some national things, including autos, etc. So that's a show of confidence and a show that although things are great and we have a lot of links with Ontario, there's more gold to be mined, not literally, but figuratively for both countries here in Ontario. We also, in the consulate in Ontario, we have about 80 people working in the consulate, and as I said, we have a small commercial office. And when the president launched his national export initiative, which aims to double exports in the United States in 5 years' time, it was very clear that Canada was one of the key places we had to do it, because while when you read the newspapers, you would think that all the business in the world is in China and India, and while I think it's great that people try and diversify their exports and imports and work with China and India, if you look at the numbers in the US and Canada, a small percentage increase in that trade dwarfs anything that's likely in the coming year or decades in Asia. So I think we need to do both, or we need to really pay attention here. So I said, well, if we only have one commercial officer, now we have two, what about having our other officers work on commercial issues? And so we started to do that. And we've been having State Department officers who have a full-time job doing something else in the consular section or the public affairs section, gaining some commercial experience by doing some general sector surveys of industries we think are hot in Ontario, and sharing that with our commerce folks and starting to build. That's been seen as quite successful, and I think will be a model in other parts of the world.